Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be painting a delicious chocolate cupcake. I hope you'll grab your paints and follow along. For today's project, I'm using my Fluid 100 140-pound cold pressed cotton watercolor paper. It is a block, so the sides are glued down, which prevents warping and buckling. I'll leave a list in the description below with all the supplies I use for this project. I'm going to start with the sketch. Just lightly drawing the outside contours of the cupcake. If the sketching portion is too tricky for you, you can download my line drawing in the description below. I'm also making sure to include in my sketch all of those little pistachios that are covering the top of the frosting. When you're sketching for a watercolor painting, the most important thing is to get down all of the areas that are the lightest in value that you want to make sure to protect later or to paint around. Always be planning ahead for the whites and the lightest areas in your painting. Just because it's a simple composition, there's not a lot going on with a cupcake, I want to challenge you guys to try the sketch, do your very best. Any opportunity you get to practice drawing is only going to make you a better artist, so give it a try. I'm also making sure I sketch on those little cracks in the cupcake itself, and adjusting any lines in the paper portion of the cupcake. Try to make the sides the same length, the same height, and make your curve as perfect as you can, but if not, no worries. I'm spraying my paints to activate them, and I'm starting with my Daniel Smith Ultramarine. I'm using a very special brush today. This is a bamboo handle goat synthetic blend brush by Lebenzen, and I'm mixing quite a generous amount of water in with the Ultramarine on my palette first, and then using this as a base layer of color for the paper portion of the cupcake. I'm just doing a flat wash all the way across, not being too concerned about making it perfectly smooth and even. This is just getting some color on the paper and covering up the white. We don't want the paper to be completely white. We want it to stand out from the background a little bit. I'm using that same color and painting a shadow shape just beneath the cupcake as well. All of this is wet and dry, so if you want to take advantage of the surface of the paper and scrape your brush across the surface to create some interesting texture, this is a great opportunity to do that. I'm now dipping into my Holbein raw umber and a little bit of leaf green, and I think the combination of these two will be a really perfect color for the pistachios on top of the cupcake. So using the tip of my tiny little brush, I'm filling in each of those pistachios with this combination of leaf green and raw umber. You really could use any yellow that's on your palette, but you'll want to make sure that it looks somewhat natural, so introducing a little bit of brown in the mixture will help create a more natural looking color. And then the pistachios, some of them have a little bit of a green in them, so if you see green in your reference photo, try to paint that in. So I'm carefully filling in each one of those. As I said before, we want to make sure we protect the lightest areas in the painting, or paint those first and then do the darker colors after that. Now for the brown of the cupcake, I'm using Daniel Smith Burnt Umber, pretty much straight out of the palette. I've added just enough water to get the paint flowing for me, but no more than that. And so here I'm carefully painting the contours of the cake portion of the cupcake. If you mess up the lines a little bit like I did there, you can just smooth it out by widening it just a little bit. You'll want to paint more carefully along the edge of the paper. And while the paint is still wet, it's a good idea to start adding those little dips where the paper cup has a crinkle along the edge. These, of course, do not have to be perfect. We're just trying to get the suggestion of the crinkly paper. Work fast here so that you don't end up with any hard lines. You want your brown to look smooth and blended. It doesn't have to be a perfect flat wash, but it does need to look like it's all the same color, all the same value for the most part. So I'm starting by just covering most of the surface with that burnt umber, slightly watered down. And while it's still wet, I can push and pull the paint all around the space, really just coloring it in, filling it in slightly. Here towards the right of the cupcake, we see a light source. It looks a little bit lighter in value. We also know that that's the light source on the right because you see a shine in the frosting on that side of the reference photo. So if you want to go a little lighter in value there to better represent the reality of the light source, definitely go a little bit lighter on the right side. While the paint's still wet, I'm continuing to add those little details, the shadow shapes in between the paper cup along this edge. Really just looks like upside down bumps. Now I'm mixing up some Daniel Smith indigo and burnt umber. When you combine equal amounts of each, it creates a nice black. And with this color, I'm going even darker with those little shadows in between the paper cup and the cake. I'm filling those in a little bit darker on the left side where I use just the burnt umber. I want to make sure it looks like the cake is moving downward and into shadow as it moves towards the cup portion. Now using more pure indigo, I'm painting on the shadows in the cake. These are those little cracks formed when the cake is baking. You'll want to make sure that your burnt umber is almost completely dry before you do this layer. So it looks a little bit shiny from this camera angle. It's got some glare on it, but it will dry darker. This is going to look like black once it's dry. And so I'm carefully filling in all those little cracks with my indigo, smoothing out that edge if it was a little bit rough. And I want to paint more carefully around the pistachio that's overlapping the cake. When you're choosing your brush for this project, make sure that it's something that has a small enough tip that you can paint all of these details, but that can also be flattened to paint more broad washes. Using that indigo, I'm painting some shadows underneath each little pistachio. This is helping those pistachios stand out against the chocolate, and it's also creating depth and contrast and giving it a realistic look. Anytime you observe light and shadow in your reference photo, include that in your painting. It's going to be very important for creating realism. Adding one more crack into the cake right here, pulling it almost all the way down to the cup. If you're finding this video helpful, please hit that like button now and hit subscribe if you're new here. It really helps me out as a creator to continue to be able to bring you great content for free like this. So thank you so much for that. One more time, I'm grabbing my indigo and darkening up those little dips in between the paper portion of the cup. Now for the frosting, I'm mixing up some burnt sienna and burnt umber. I want the frosting to be just a little bit lighter in value than the cake itself, but pretty close to the same color. So now I'm using that more watered down version of burnt umber and burnt sienna and carefully painting in between those pistachios, working slowly enough so that I can be accurate, painting around my pencil marks. Watch for little areas where the frosting is shiny and catching the light. Try to paint around those highlights. If you didn't indicate them with your pencil marks, now is your chance to draw with your paintbrush. So under this pistachio, I see just a little highlight. I'm painting carefully around that. Here in the very center of the frosting, there's a couple little highlights just to the right of that pistachio that's dipping down. And there's a really strong highlight on the far right. We already pointed that out, talking about the light source. So really carefully paint around that highlight. That's going to be the most important one in this whole image. When you're working from a reference photo, things that you want to really take note of and try to include in your painting are going to be your light source, areas that are brightest in value or lightest in value, and areas that are darkest in value. Those are all going to be the most important things to capture if you want your painting to look realistic. Contrast and a good variety in your values is everything. So I'm continuing to work with this beautiful rich brown, filling in that frosting. You can use more of a scrubbing motion when you're working with slightly larger shapes. But always be looking at your reference photo and looking back and forth between your photo and your painting and observing those highlights. I see another little highlight here right in the center of the frosting. And so I'm going to carefully paint around that one. And a little shape here, almost an upside down triangle. Completing the chocolate at the very top. And if you need to dip in your paint just to get a little bit more and a little more water to make it flow, you can do that. One more little space to fill in. There we go. Once the frosting is completely filled in, you can just double check and make sure you've got all your values correct. So here I'm just darkening up a few more little shadow shapes that I see where it might be just slightly darker. Just grabbing a second layer of paint. Doesn't have to be darker paint, but just adding another layer will automatically darken that transparent paint. Here I'm adding another little shadow under the pistachio and outlining this one here in the center. And I'm pretty happy with that. So now it's time to paint the paper cup portion of the cupcake. I'm starting with these vertical lines. Well, they're almost vertical. They're somewhat angled, following the contours of the outer edges of the cupcake. And you can see what a nice tiny tip this brush comes to with such a tiny little point on here. And I'm just basically outlining my pencil marks with paint using my burnt umber. Gently painting the contours, the outside edges. Now you might be looking at the reference photo and thinking, whoa, that's really complex. How do I do that? We're just going to be painting an impression here. So to simplify it, I'm just starting with the vertical lines that I see, those vertical shadow shapes coming down from the cupcake. And I'm starting on the outer edges of each little curve. You can see the shadow shapes sort of emerge in between the bumps that are coming up. And so look for the point of origin with each stripe. And from there, you can just create a pattern moving all the way along the cupcake from top to bottom or bottom to top, however you want to do it. You'll notice that those stripes get slightly wider apart as you come towards the center. This is just because our perspective changes. So just gently, carefully paint each stripe. It's almost like painting whiskers. You want to try to complete each one in a single motion if possible. Once you've got all of your vertical marks on, grab some watered down paint and do some dry brush effects across the surface of the paper. So scraping your brush gently across the surface, you'll want to miss little areas so you have some spots that are still light in value and other areas that are darker. And you can see how this is creating that impression of some of the cake poking through the paper cup. I'm grabbing a little bit of indigo, going darker in some of these areas. Still just kind of dry brush, scumbling with my brush, missing little areas of the paper. This is where having some paper with some tooth and texture is going to be helpful. The cold pressed paper is just the right amount of tooth, I think, for this. So with that indigo burnt umber mixture, I'm adding a darker value all across the top, but really avoiding, especially the rim of the paper cup, we want that to be much lighter in value and to look like it's sort of protruding away from the cake. And so something so complex looking was really quite simple to paint. Now for one last finishing touch, I'm grabbing just another layer of my ultramarine and darkening up that shadow one more time with a quick wash of paint. There was a little bit of brown left in my brush, but I actually really like how that looks mixed with the ultramarine. Removing some excess water. One final detail, I'm adding a little bit of this brilliant permanent green #1 to some of those pistachios, just making it a little more obvious that they are pistachios, giving it that little green hint. And I'm liking how that looks. And there is our finished chocolate cupcake. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.